I think as far as the difference between Glenn and Matt, I think there is a big difference between them. Quite honestly, I think the primary one is that Glenn is smart, and I don't think that Matt is particularly that intelligent at this point. The vanguard will be there, sir. And kind of more interestingly, Musk is, well, maybe not more interesting, but he's like completely consumed by like his insecurity, right? And Thiel, I don't think is to the extent that Thiel's insecurity drives him. I think that it's like kind of like a motivator for him to get back at people and to attack people, while Musk just like desperately wants to be loved. And then if you don't love him, he hates you forever. Thiel, I think, is like more calculating, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, well, that's actually one of the main reasons that I thought this conversation would be so important. Oh, and because, you write so much about Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel is such a powerful person. He's so central to a lot of the politics that we're discussing and the ideological movements within the Republican Party. And I feel like, one thing that this show might be guilty of is not focusing enough on him. Focusing more on Elon Musk because he's so, cartoonish and stupid, and he does so many embarrassing things. I think Peter Thiel kind of is, like you said, more sophisticated. He kind of hides in the shadows more and pulls the strings in a more hidden way. So if you could kind of just break down for our audience the actual provable influence that Peter Thiel specifically has over the right-wing media, because I feel like there's a lot of these things where it's like, Peter Thiel invested in Rumble, but then, people that work for Rumble will deny that he has anything to do with it. And they'll make you feel stupid if you even point that out. Oh, what? You think just because he invested money, he's controlling me? He's pulling the puppet strings? Like, what are you, some conspiracy theorist? But I think that his influence does go a lot deeper than is visible on the surface. And if you could just kind of spell that out in layman's terms for our audience, how this guy specifically has amassed an army of right-wing media people, followers, whatever.
Sure. Well, I'll start with what you were just talking about. And Glenn Greenwald, who's one of the topics of the book, uses this technique quite a bit to stop criticism of him taking at least hundreds of thousands of dollars from Rumble to produce his show there. And what I would say to that is that Thiel invested in Rumble. He led a funding round in Rumble in May of 2021. It was Thiel and JD Vance led this funding round. And in August of 2021, Rumble started giving deals to people to come on to the platform to start making their shows. And one of the first ones was to Glenn. It was announced the same day as one to Tulsi Gabbard. So I think that it strains credulity to think that like there's no influence here from that money. But saying that aside,
by the way, just to cut in real quick, I remember when that happened, and they actually bragged about Tulsi's hire as proof that, oh no, we're not a right-wing media company. We just hired this prominent Democratic ex-congresswoman to do a show. See, we're platforming leftists.
yeah. I mean, she was actually the lead of the article in the Washington Post, I think, that had the exclusive on it. But it is kind of funny that with Glenn, they were like, yeah, but he is right-wing, so we'll just like whatever. But for his actual influence, though, I think his deeper influence, more than just Rumble, it goes into all the politicians that he has invested in. And if you want to go into like all of his different like cultural and news media investments, we could be sitting here for. I mean, I could just read from Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto. I mean, he has like 7 pages of just going like, one after another, and that book came out like 2 or 3 years ago, so it's only continued. Thiel has thrown tons of money into shaping cultural and media kind of narratives and thought. Like over the Dime Square stuff in New York, that little cultural scene. A lot of that is funded by Thiel. There's Thiel money in like kind of all of these different podcasts. But outside of that, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, keep going.
No, yeah, but outside of that, I would say that he is one of JD Vance's like earliest and strongest supporters. JD Vance and him, I think they worked together in Silicon Valley, and then when JD wanted to become the senator from Ohio, Thiel, I think, was one of, or if not his biggest donor. Blake Masters, failed Senate candidate from Arizona, another example. Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Ron Paul. Trump himself in 2016, not so much in 2024, but also in 2020. This guy has had his money behind a lot of the people who have shaped Republican politics over the last decade or 2 decades. And that has paid off for him in that he has like a role in the party now. He has influence. But I think that to go back to Musk, I think this is where you see Thiel's influence the most. So Thiel, one of the reasons that Thiel is so rich is that he co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk at the end of the 90s. And then they sold that to eBay. And I think they sold it for like $1 billion or something like that, which at the time was, quite a bit of money. And then it still is quite a bit of money, but at the point that these guys are at now,
boys with $1 billion only. I don't know.
Right? Yeah, only $1 billion, only a single billion. But so they both ended up with hundreds of millions of dollars. They both invested in different things, and one of the things that Thiel did was he co-founded Palantir, which is the kind of notorious surveillance.
Okay, yeah, I have a question for you about that, because one of the things that I've been so again, Ro Khanna, I think there's good and bad things that you could say about the guy. I appreciate that he engages with independent media at the rate that he does. He doesn't just brush aside knuckleheads like us who are like, why the fuck are you doing this, Ro? But one of the things that we've been breaking his balls about repeatedly over here is as late as February of this year, this dude was stocking up on Palantir stocks, and we know now and we had known for a long time how involved Peter Thiel was in Palantir, obviously, and in the Trump administration. So while you're making the case that we have to oppose this fascist regime, you're also profiting off of it. As you make the case that we need to radically oppose ICE, you're actually profiting off of it, because we know for a fact Palantir, as early as the time that Ro Khanna was investing in them, was profiting off of collaborating with ICE, and he responded to public pressure and sold. But I'm just like, that shows you how even the people who are on the progressive left are being infected by this Peter Thiel money, because it's such a good stock investment, because they knew, and their accountants knew, and their stockbrokers knew, hey, you invest in this, it's going to go up, because guess who just got reelected fucking president, right? This guy's goons. And, for people who don't know, I bring it up sometimes. My background when I was going to college was going into, I was trying to get into venture capital, as disgusting as that sounds, right? I did not want to be poor. So I was like, fuck, what can you do to make money? You go invest in startups or whatever. Peter Thiel has this reputation as like a kingmaker in Silicon Valley. He's one of the most successful and well-known, kind of venture capital investors. He does a ton of angel investing in incubators. He really makes his presence known there. And even though Elon Musk, Sergey Brin, a lot of these other guys, they have more money in terms of Silicon Valley social capital and pernicious influence, I feel like Peter Thiel almost dwarfs all of them because of his Rolodex, right? All of the people he knows, all the dinners he's had, all of the fucking dirt he has on everyone.
I think that's really sharp, and I think that it's good to distinguish social capital from financial capital, right? Because Thiel has this reputation now as an angel investor or as a kingmaker, but for a long time he didn't, in part because he stupidly sold a bunch of his Facebook stock before Facebook blew up. And for a long time, that was the narrative around Thiel, because early on, Palantir, just to go back to Palantir for a sec, made almost all of its money off of government contracts. In fact, the government was the only source of its income, I think, for the first 6 or 7 years of its existence. So Thiel's outside investments weren't really paying off quite as well, although he was doing better than Mark Andreessen, who was really not doing very well except for his investment in Facebook. Now Thiel has not only the social capital of being kingmaker, but also as Trump's kind of longtime voice in Silicon Valley, even though that kind of fell off a little bit over the last year. But I think now he's kind of back.
I do want to talk a little bit about one portion of your book, Eoin. I thought this was pretty cool. First time in my memory that the Vanguard actually was mentioned in a book, an actual published book. So very cool. Thank you for including our show and your analysis here in this portion of the book. Obviously, you're talking about Glenn Greenwald and his shift, related to his views on the trans community. And this is something that we discussed on the show maybe 2 or 3 years ago, maybe even longer. It's been a while. But that was a really good discussion. I enjoyed that conversation with Glenn. And I do have a question for you, Eoin, about Glenn Greenwald specifically, because obviously Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi are two of the main figures that you write about in this book. Obviously, Glenn Greenwald has been on this show. He's been on the show 2 or 3 or 4 times, had a pretty friendly relationship, although we've obviously been able to challenge him on air, as you mentioned here in the book. I'm wondering, and by the way, if Glenn happened to be listening, I'd you're welcome to come on the show and respond to the criticisms made. Definitely not afraid of having that conversation either. I honestly think it would be pretty interesting, but I'm interested, in my opinion, Greenwald and Taibbi are on different paths at this point. I think that Taibbi is far more embarrassing. And the main reason I say that is because, he made his whole thing about free speech. So did Glenn Greenwald. For a long time, that was their main concern, right? Now, of course, the biggest threat to free speech is the Israeli censorship of, advocates for Palestine, critics of the IDF and of the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And Matt Taibbi has completely remained, he's kept his mouth shut. He claims to not have an opinion. When people challenge him on this, he'll say, I don't even know enough about what's going on to have a take. I'm just going to keep my thoughts private because I don't know enough, which is a total fucking excuse. This has been a conflict that's been unfolding throughout his entire adult life. Obviously, Matt Taibbi knows what right and wrong is, or at least he at one point did. And even if he doesn't care about Palestinian lives, viewing it through the lens of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff, of course it's important. It is the most important issue in regard to that discussion. Glenn, on the other hand, has actually done a very good job, even in the post, Trump re-election era. I think he's done a really good job, not only calling out the Trump administration, but also other people on the right, people like Ben Shapiro, a lot of other bad actors and right-wing media who completely use the defense of free speech as this, tool to get power and then abandon it as quickly as they possibly could. So I do think that there's a little bit of a difference. And I do think that Glenn, is despite my continued disagreements with him, I do think he's in a slightly different place. And I was just wondering, do you think there's a chance he could kind of break free from this rumble sphere, if he were ever to want to? Because I do think he's kind of woken up to a lot of the evils of the Trump administration and a lot of the stuff that a lot of people got duped into believing. So what's your thoughts on that?
All right. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll try and keep them somewhat lined up in coherence. So to kind of address what you said in order. So I'll start with the book. Yes, I found that conversation that you guys had with him to be a very revealing one about his thoughts on that issue at that time. When I challenged him, so I talked to Glenn for a couple hours for this book. He gave me his time. We had a cordial, if occasionally combative conversation. But it was fine. It was I guess about as friendly as it could be, considering that I was writing a book that was critical of him. But he definitely gave me his time and offered his opinion on things, which I think comes out in the book. I quote him quite a bit.
I know,
but I just wanted.
That was interesting.
Yeah, and I also wanted to tell you guys that in our discussion when we were talking about this, he specifically told me to go listen to that episode to get his thoughts on that. So just so you guys know, he told me. Now, as it happened, I already had, and so I was like, "Oh, that's great that you tell me," because I actually have questions about this specifically, so we were able to talk about it. But just so you guys know, he specifically said that he wanted me to cite back to your show. So, I think as far as the difference between Glenn and Matt, I think there is a big difference between them. Quite honestly, I think the primary one is that Glenn is smart, and I don't think that Matt is particularly that intelligent. At this point,
I would have argued with you at one point pretty hardcore, because Matt was a huge influence on me, and that's why it breaks my heart so much to watch what's happened to him. But I mean, when I was in business school, I was I took a creative writing class, and I read Bush Like Me, and I read The Great American Bubble Machine, and I read all these works, and I was like, bro, you can't hold these opinions and then continue to go live your life the way that you know what I mean? So it's crazy to just watch him abandon all of that, because
I want to be really, really clear here that when I say that I think that Glenn is smarter than Matt, I'm not even saying that Glenn is a better writer than Matt, because I think Matt's probably a better writer than Glenn, as far as having skill, having voice. But there's a difference between there's a difference in intelligence, and I think that for Matt, I think that I think that the big difference between them is that I don't think that Glenn completely believes in this stuff to the extent that Matt does. And I think if you look at Glenn's career path over the last 20 years, you see somebody who has had certain principles that he has more or less adhered to, and some that have seemed flexible. So let's take Israel and Palestine, right? Glenn has been in favor of Palestinian liberation and against the Israeli apartheid regime for, I would say, pretty much his entire career, at least as far as I was able to find going back on it. The difference in the way that he talks about it now is that now he is like upset with people on the right for not adhering to what he pretends are their free speech principles and acting kind of, in his words, like liberals or like people on the left. I think that's dishonest. But I don't think it's dishonest for him to continue to say that Palestine is an issue where it is a pretty black and white issue, and like, you know, like and the protesting in favor of Palestine is something that you should not be penalized for, right? In the U.S., right? He's been consistent on that. His language around it has changed because now he has a right-wing audience, and now he's kind of more on the right politically, and so he is like talking to people who are on the right and saying, you know, like, you shouldn't be like liberals and be like censorious liberals. I think that's kind of my biggest issue with Glenn's general shift on some of these issues now that it's become kind of hard to ignore how bad the speech stuff is under Trump, is that Glenn has kind of like moved to this thing where he's still implying or directly saying that there's this like all-powerful, censorious, like left-wing regime within like deep state within the government, even though the Republicans control like the entire federal government at the moment, and Trump is taking these actions to ensure that the GOP is going to continue to dominate these agencies. And I think that Glenn's comments on Twitter like a month or two ago, when Trump like kind of out of his, you know, oatmeal slurry brain said something like, "Oh, we're gonna like cut the military," and Glenn was like, "See, this is like a total example of this. See," and it's like, no, and like and everybody, like Adam Johnson, I think, was one of the people who really got under his skin about this, but was like, "This is ridiculous. Like, you're being completely insane." And Glenn got really mad about it. And now, of course, like Trump wants to increase the budget, and Glenn hasn't said anything about it. So
$1 trillion budget.
$1 trillion budget, right? So I think that's like an important piece of context to understand here for Glenn's politics on this stuff. But I would also say that Glenn is, and I think this might have something to do with kind of his lawyer brain, the way that he talks about stuff often leaves him with an out, right? He usually he's smart enough to phrase his stuff to kind of hedge it, so that it's not, so that if you go back and look at something that Glenn said like 2 or 3 years ago, right? If you don't know the whole context, if you don't know the context of like the discourse that's going on Twitter, if he's talking about Twitter, or you don't know, like if you're not putting the context of all the other articles that are going on and like what he's responding to, right? What he says, you might disagree with it, but you're like, oh, well, that does seem kind of reasonable. And in some cases it is, obviously. But then there are other situations when it's not. When he's taking a very, very partisan approach to an issue, or he's taking a very partisan position. And
I also think that something that you point out in the book that I thought was a really, you know, good way to put it with some of these characters, including Greenwald, it's like, it's not necessarily that they just became Republicans, but they started to view liberals as their enemy, and they started, I think you said, to perversely view people on the right as friends, you know, folks like Tucker Carlson, the list goes on. And that's kind of where I started to be like, okay, something's happening here, even if I still kind of agree with a lot of what someone like that is saying. Like, it's hard to argue with, like you said, they leave themselves an out sometimes, but it's kind of undeniable what side you're gravitating towards, who you're hanging out with, what circles you're, you know, associating with, and who you're turning your fire on. Yeah,
Jim Norekas of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting made that point to me early on in reporting out the book, and I thought it was just really sharp. Like, he listed off a few things that were kind of like, even by the time that I was doing the final edits on the book, were no longer kind of relevant, because DeSantis was no longer such a relevant character. But he was like, you know, like, they're not saying anything about all of this stuff happening in Florida, like at the time, like the Don't Say Gay bill and all of that. But you know, but they're getting mad about, you know, AOC saying something, you know. But I would say that Glenn's approach in that kind of being able to hedge, and has not only offered him a way to kind of credibly criticize the Trump administration, maybe in ways that he wouldn't be able to if he were a little more partisan. It also allows it so that maybe in the future, if he needs to pivot back to the left, which I don't think he would really do, but you never know. He like the groundwork is kind of there. Like he's been critical enough of like both sides that he could like presumably do that. Now, the reason that I'm bringing that up isn't to say that he's going to do that or that's what his aim is here, but it's to say that Matt Taibbi has gone so far in the other direction that it's impossible for him to do something like that. And not only is it impossible to do something, like his credibility is completely shot.
Dude, I went on bullshit lawsuit for the libel over the congresswoman that nobody's even covering because it's such dog shit.
It's total bullshit. There's like, she said basically that people have said that you were like a serial sexual harasser of women, or like that's the allegation, and then asked to like put in things that made that allegation. Now, that allegation may be bullshit and maybe not. But there's nothing libelous about saying, hey, people have said this about you. Like there just isn't. And like, responding to a tweet by Aaron Rupar online does not like rise to the standard of defamation. You know what I mean? Like it's not. But even putting that aside, like I went to his Twitter account a couple times over the last 2 or 3 months when I was writing this article for The Nation, kind of like looking at Taibbi and Greenwald and Barry Weiss. In the age of Trump, and it was just all like anti-vax stuff and all anti-trans stuff, and then the only stuff that wasn't that was kind of reliving Russiagate and reliving the Twitter files, and I was and am very critical of Russiagate, the kind of the liberal conspiracy theory around that. I think the Twitter files were a nothing burger. I'm just putting my cards on the table for that. But just to say that either way, it doesn't matter. Like that shit was like 3 to 5 years ago. Okay. It's like 2025 now. Like
Russiagate was 9 years ago.
Yeah. 9 years ago. Right. 9 years ago. And for him to be,
I was in college.
For him to still be like living this stuff up like that. I think it's kind of pathetic. And, I think that it just shows that he doesn't really have any ideas, because all he can do is just kind of promote these culture war things, like this like transphobic stuff and this anti-vax stuff, and then just like play the hits. And I just don't think that that's particularly interesting. But beyond that, not only is it not particularly interesting, it's also like the most insane gutter right-wing politics you could imagine. And so, while someone like Glenn would still be able to kind of stand up for free speech on principle in some ways, even though like I would be someone who would be critical of that, but even I would like admit that like my criticism of him, while I think that it's like legit, might come across as a little pedantic, right? Compared to Taibbi, where if he started saying something like that, I think everybody would be like, "Oh, this is just ridiculous! Like you're insane."
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there. Be there. The Vanguard will be there.